On behalf of Apigee and Carahsoft, I would like to welcome you to Session 3 of our Middleware and Application Development webcast series, APIs, a Key to Rationalizing IT Costs. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about Carahsoft. Carahsoft is a government IT solutions provider delivering industry-leading technology products, services, and training to federal, state, local, and education customers on behalf of top-tier manufacturers like Apigee, Red Hat, Adobe, Symantec, and VMware. Our contact information will be at the end of the presentation, so please don't hesitate to contact us for any of your needs. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webcast, John Rethans and Brian Pagano. John applies the experience he's gained across roles in product innovation, strategy, and education to work with Apigee's major enterprise customers, supporting their efforts to develop and implement new business and organizational strategies as they embark on their digital transformation journeys. Brian is lead evangelist for digital success at Apigee. Before Apigee, Brian was chief architect of Guardian Life on Wall Street. He also spent several years in Europe, serving as the chief architect of a software company in Milan and as CTO of a software company in Turin, Italy. He did research and development at Saga Software, a company that made middleware solutions. Brian started his career as a programmer specializing in object-oriented languages. John and Brian, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, folks. Really appreciate you joining us today. We love talking about this stuff, and hopefully there'll be some good nuggets of value for you. If you have any questions, please let us know. We'll be happy to take those along the way. As stated, the topic today is we're going to talk a little bit about rationalizing IT, and the reason for this is IT is being asked to do a bunch of new stuff. I mean, I guess that's always the case with IT.
That's right.
A lot of new things, a lot of new devices, a lot of new demands from employees, from partners, from developers.
And lots of extra money to do these things, right?
Well, that's the issue, right? You're working basically with the same budget or reduced budget, depending on your situation. And you've got to not only keep the lights on and keep moving like you have been, but you've got to find a way to get some money back into the budget to meet some of these new demands. So yeah, here's our mugs. You heard a little about us in the introductions. We always put these videos up on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Apigee. So this video and several others are there if you prefer getting your information in a video way. We also put the decks up on slideshare.com/Apigee. And we also have a little community site where it's a great place to ask questions that didn't occur to you during the course of the webinar. We've got tons of videos and great content to learn. I think it's one of the best content repositories for the digital economy. And with that out of the way,
Socrates.
Let's talk about Greek philosophers. Yes. So, well, you know me. It wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't talk about a dead Greek philosopher in there somewhere. No, I felt with the title of rationalization, we pretty much had to bring him in. Right. So let's talk a little bit about doing more with less and cleaning house. And
so this is where we get into like ripping out all the legacy systems and replacing them all, right?
Yeah, you're doing a good job counterbalancing this content today. No, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. We are not talking about firing a bunch of people.
That's right.
We are not talking about ripping and replacing a bunch of stuff that
That's
you
right.
spent the last 3 years putting into place.
Or 30 years.
Or 30 years, depending on the system, exactly.
Right.
John, you want to walk us through this value chain and why it's relevant to this conversation?
Exactly. So this is how Apigee sees the world in terms of the digital value chain. And really what we're talking about here is all of you, particularly if you're working in the world of IT, are very aware of your backends and you understand that you've got users, in this case, in the case of government, agencies or citizens that are going to be using what you provide. And again, you're doing more services with less money. So how do you get these users, how do you allow them to have the experiences with government that they need to have while doing it with less money? That's really what this is about. And so what we recommend is when you're thinking about APIs, the way to look at this is your APIs are going to be used by developers to create apps or experiences or services for those agencies, for those citizens. And so think about it from the prospect of what do those users need? What are you being asked to do? And then use APIs to reuse the services you already have in the back end in your legacy systems to meet those needs, as opposed to having to buy whole new systems and implement them or rip and replace.
Got it. And I think that really ties into this sort of architecture, I guess, let's not even call it an architecture diagram, this conceptual diagram, which talks about, for me coming out of enterprise IT, it was very important for me to make this kind of mental pivot because I had ESBs. I had SOA, I'd been doing that for years. I'd done a lot of integration. What I hadn't done a lot of was exposure and certainly almost nothing to do with consumption. Right? I wasn't thinking about how much friction could I take out of the equation when developers, internal developers or partners or whoever was going to build an app based on this data, based on these services. I was just simply trying to integrate my systems so I had single sources of truth and not duplicate repositories everywhere.
That's right.
And I was trying to get them minimally exposed. Generally, that meant like a web service or something like that.
Right.
Now, we're talking about something different here.
Absolutely, yeah. What we're talking about here is decoupling. So, for those of you joining the webcast, you're dealing with legacy systems. In the case of government procurement, it takes years to just write the spec, get the product in, and then implement it. And so you've got these core systems, and those take years to get installed. And what we're talking about is decoupling, so that you can actually keep those core legacy systems, and as we said earlier, reuse them to react to the changes and the challenges that are being put on you to create new services quickly. For government open governance projects or mandates that you may have to get more data out to other agencies or user groups.
Okay, and this decoupling is, I think, key to the conversation we're having today. Because
Absolutely.
It's not the only thing that APIs bring as far as finding money to bring back into your IT budget.
Right.
But this decoupling brings a lot of immediate benefits, like
Absolutely.
you said, like some reuse.
That's right.
Like speed, time to mission, time to value, bringing on new developers, just bringing on new contractors, a new partner, hiring a new development team.
Absolutely.
Getting those ideas into production faster just is simply going to equate to fewer person days.
Absolutely.
It's got to be
Absolutely.
cheaper.
And that's the key thing to take away from this diagram is you've got your large core systems indicated by the big gear, which moves slowly. And these smaller systems, these smaller gears are actually moving at a totally different cadence. And that difference in cadence, that difference in speed between those two groups, separated and decoupled by the API layer, is kind of the foundation of a lot of what we're going to talk about.
Okay, got it.
How to rationalize IT costs.
Sounds good. So the big gear is big systems and the little gears are little systems.
Little systems.
That's
spinning at different sizes.
Clever. I like it when it works out like that. All right, so let's just define a couple terms here to make sure we're not talking around each other.
Right.
Cost avoidance, right? This is not paying for something that you otherwise would have had to pay.
That's right.
And then cost savings is I'm already paying this. I've got some kind of recurring payment or I'm already committed to a payment. How can I reduce that payment? Those are the two areas we're going to focus on here, and not really about other aspects of budgeting like ROI or chargebacks or other things that are really fodder for a different conversation.
Exactly.
All right, and so we broke these down into 4 categories because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the first place a lot of people look when they're trying to find money to bring back into their budget is shelfware.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think that's where the search stops for a lot of people.
Right.
Like, what have we bought in the last 2-3 years
Right.
that we're not using?
Right.
Well, let's get rid of that. Let's stop paying maintenance. Let's whatever, not renew that contract. But there's a lot more to it, right?
Totally. I mean, because shelfware is obviously it's a great place to start looking, but really if you think only about shelfware, you're allowing yourself to get boxed in by the constraints that you already have. And so what we're talking about with this concept of decoupling and using an API layer is it actually blows a lot of those constraints away. So now, without those constraints, there's a lot more you can actually do.
Perfect. Well, let's dig into some of those. Right. So if we break down operational savings, right, we can say that what do we mean by operational here? It's not like the traditional operations center that's 24/7, running and doing your continuity, but it's more like where are you having bottleneck? Where are transactions taking longer than they need to be taking? Or how can I get something that's going to help me to do capacity planning?
Right.
Because I think most folks are experiencing what I experienced, which was the amount of time from realizing that I needed some kind of capacity, whether it's storage, network, compute, whatever it is, till the time it got procured, till the time it got the golden image and locked down and racked and stacked, was about an 18-month runway for me.
Exactly. All the while, you don't have the capacity that your users need right now.
And to be honest, I didn't really know what kind of capacity I was going to need.
That's
and 18 months, much less what I needed next month.
Right.
And so I needed some tools, I needed some techniques to help me do some capacity planning better.
Right.
That's a great place to try to find some savings. Because what people tend to do is kind of cover themselves by saying, well, let me just vastly overestimate what I need. Order 10 times as much stuff. And now we're kind of back to shelfware.
And is really the opposite of rationalization, right?
It is. Irrationalization?
It's irrationalization.
Okay. Of course, caching is a subtle one, but it is an operational level. So this is when real-time transactions are going through, right, at runtime. But a lot of, I remember working with some of the big weather companies, weather providers, and they only change the forecast every half an hour. And yet every single inbound request was going to the back end.
Right.
I mean, what a waste, right? What a waste on those computing resources, on the network.
Wear and tear.
Exactly. There was by simply caching those calls until they updated the forecast in half an hour, we cut down like 1 billion calls a day to the back end. So there's a huge amount of money back into the IT budget to start doing innovation, to start doing some of these new things.
Exactly.
So let's jump over to one of my favorite topics coming off of Wall Street, which is regulatory and compliance. Right? These are the kind of things that are not financial drivers. These are the kind of things you have to do.
Right, exactly. And I can imagine, or we can imagine, in the government world, more than any place else, this is probably a really big issue.
Exactly. So I know for me, anytime the Corporate Security Office changed a policy, anytime Congress or one of the regulatory bodies changed something, and frankly, sometimes just our internal audit committees change the formats they wanted things, I had to go chase that down in about 80 systems.
Right.
And say, okay, well, now we need to collect this kind of data. Now we need this kind of formatting. Again,
that was all time you weren't spending bringing new services on board.
Well, that's the hamster wheel. This is more like the projection of how I felt during those days. I had a limited number of people that could work on innovation, and I felt like so many of them were on this hamster wheel, just constantly making these little updates to regulatory and compliance issues.
Right.
So having that decoupling platform we were talking about earlier, just so happens that that's a perfect point in the architecture to also capture this kind of compliance information, to do attestations, and to give the audit committee, to have it just auto format, however the audit committee wants it this month, right? Instead of paying a bunch of people, instead of doing innovation to now rewrite things for the audit committee, well, we'll just configure some policies and have it spit out in exactly the format that
exactly. And now all those people can go and innovate and work on those projects that you wanted to work on but just couldn't get done.
Right, because I can't just keep hiring infinite numbers of people. I've got the same number of people, and I'd much rather them working on mobile and social and the personalization and context and location, all the kind of things that modern apps need that we didn't have on anything built more than 2 years ago, and they can't do it because they're on that hamster wheel.
Exactly.
And then another one comes to development, right? Another place where people might not be thinking to look for savings. Want to talk about headaches of homegrown systems?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we can just build all this stuff ourselves, right? I mean, if you have a new service that you need to build up, why buy any software? We're engineers, we can code this, we can build it. Why not do that? I mean, really the biggest problem is that you end up having now legacy systems that you've built and only you or your team can manage and no one else can.
Right.
And furthermore, in the case of APIs, if you're building your own APIs, you get this kind of jungle of connections between different systems and users that aren't tied into a common platform. And how do you manage that? It's really, really difficult.
Exactly. And I think if you take it, kind of bring in philosophy, if you take it to its extreme, right, reductio ad absurdum, you're going to find like who would build their own web browsers, who would build their own databases, who would build their own network routers. If you're not building those kind of things, you probably should look for other places that are just not core to your functionality. Buy those components and spend those resources and those dollars you've got on innovation that's specific to you.
Right, and that goes back to that digital value chain where spend your time and energy on meeting the needs of your users, whether those be citizens or other agencies, or warfighters. Meet those people's needs and put all your energy there. Don't worry about building the software because it's already been built.
That's right. That's right. And the second point I think could be construed as controversial. Now I have to say I love code. I love code as much as the next guy. I'm a reformed programmer myself, and still occasionally when I get that odd minute, like to dabble in some of the newer languages. We don't mean get rid of code. Code is necessary. Right. The APIs, that abstraction layer, that decoupling layer, has to talk to something.
Absolutely. Right. And the issue is, remember we were talking about that abstraction layer, you have the big wheel and the small wheels, and they're moving at different speeds. And the smaller wheels, which is where your users are, they're moving much faster than your likely ability to be able to code to keep up with them. And that's why we're talking about doing configuration. Because configuration allows you to keep up with that, and you can spend your time coding where it needs to be done on those big systems.
There's also good reasons to write code and bad reasons to write code. And some of the stuff I was talking about in the previous section on the regulatory, I mean, a bad reason to write code is that you've got a perfectly working system, and everyone's happy, and somebody needs to give you data in a slightly different format.
That's right.
Or needs to consume data in a slightly different format.
That's right.
That's just got configuration written all over it. That's a filter. That is not code, right? I mean, it can be done with code, but the amount of overhead to spin up a project, the kind of governance, funding, project management, requirements sign off, QA, QC, all that kind of stuff is just it's very heavy compared to having an already operationalized system
Right.
where a configuration can be made, where a filter can be applied.
Absolutely.
So that's really what we mean is don't write bad code. Use it for innovation. Use it for the good stuff, not
Exactly.
for simple little changes.
Exactly.
And then another place where I see a lot of folks wasting money is on ramping their development teams.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean,
because people are using SOA-based APIs, or they're reading through reams of documents and having to spend lots of time in review and QA. And instead of doing that, they could be working with a RESTful API and bringing teams on board really quickly and leveraging those services to their users and other agencies.
Well, I mean, think about what it's like right now for most organizations bringing on a team of, say, 3 developers today. So
Right.
welcome aboard, folks. And
Here.
here's 1,000 pages of documentation
Exactly.
on all the naming conventions, because each department has a different naming convention,
Right.
and each different type of data has different naming conventions, and they're written in different languages by different teams.
Which is not
years.
even talking about processes and MRDs and PRDs and DBRDs and all kinds of RDs.
Exactly. It's really impossible to guess, so you have no choice but to read that 1,000 pages of documentation, since there's
Exactly.
no pattern.
Right.
And so the time it takes for a new team to get productive is necessarily huge.
Right.
And so people are wasting a lot of time where if they had modern tools and they said, you know what, we've got the functionality you're looking for exposed as an API. You guys know how to use APIs. That's how you build everything nowadays.
Right.
Websites, mobile apps, Internet of Things, it's all APIs. So that means you can use your favorite languages, you can use your favorite tools, the stuff that you're already productive doing, yeah, you can do that.
Right.
The testing methodology you've got, whatever. So it just crunches down that time to value
Exactly.
and makes it just much faster from the time someone's brought on board to the time they've got that first hello world
Right.
on the screen. It's probably something more valuable than hello
Exactly.
world.
And if you're a government agency and you're providing information to the public, what better way to provide to the public than to provide it in such a way that developers who are out in the public that are already doing RESTful APIs with everything else that they do, they can now use these government services exactly as they would services from any of their commercial partners.
Yeah, exactly. And I can't state enough how much developers are very particular about their favorite tools, their favorite languages. Now, sometimes there are restrictions on what you can and can't use,
Right.
but in the absence of those restrictions, right, given an API that they can program against, you really don't care what that presentation tier is like, because all the data security is being applied to that layer. You can allow developers to use their favorite tools, and that not only makes them more productive faster,
Right.
but it buys you a ton of goodwill.
Right.
I found that even just badged employees will just demonstrate more creativity, more innovation when they're happy.
Right. Exactly. When they're not fighting through some interface that takes them forever.
Exactly. So let's jump over to process savings, this next category. I know you go around the world talking to companies about how to improve their processes.
Right.
Again, a place I don't think people are necessarily looking for cost savings, because I think most people would have in their minds, well, we're trying to minimize process all the time. That's just inherent. But the reality is that people are using outdated governance for modern technologies. Is that right? Did I say that right?
Absolutely. No, that's exactly what it is. And the issue is how this ties into IT costs is a lot of times people say, okay, well, we're trying to improve our processes. So what they do is they create an even more complex process with more steps. And really what we're talking about here is because you've, again, decoupled, and now any of these apps that you're developing don't need to touch the backend systems at all. All the parts of your process that have to do with managing services around backends, that's all gone. And now really all you're focusing on is, I've got this API, I'm managing like a product, and I just need to manage that interaction between the developer and the API, and I can leave everything else out. And that greatly simplifies the governance of it all.
Absolutely. And I think it's natural that people try to apply their existing processes to new technologies, to new methodologies. But this is one area where we've really seen that it's just far too heavy-handed. What was needed before is simply not needed right now.
Absolutely.
And then the other one is something near and dear to my heart, which is vendor upgrades. When you have the presentation tier directly tied, I know everyone, all the technology people on the call here are shaking their heads. I mean, who would do that, right? But when you do, because it happens far more often than any of us care to think, when you've got that presentation tier directly tied into the guts, to the implementation details, any change on either side is catastrophic to the whole system. The entire chain has to change. And this is architecture 101, right? Decouple things that change frequently from things that don't change frequently. We talked about that giant gear in the back end, which ironically has a lot of change, has a lot of thrash between ripping out vendors, patching, zero-day exploits, all the kind of things you're doing back there. And the front end has a lot of thrash with new device form factors coming out and new developers. And so the idea of keeping those two things in sync is kind of insane.
Yeah, totally. And just to talk a little bit about, again, that cadence on the front side, on the app side, folks expect their apps to change every 6 months or so. I mean, if you pull out your smartphone, you'll see that you'll have to update your apps, constantly. It's always happening. So to think that you're going to create this brittle system, this brittle link between the back end and your service that you're providing, and that's going to stay the same for any real period of time is not really in touch with how reality is right now.
Yeah, exactly. And so this decoupling, this is definitely the pattern that we're talking about on this broadcast. Is this decoupling allows you to break that cycle and allows you to say, okay, I can make changes on either side.
Right.
It's no longer catastrophic. It no longer affects the whole. In fact, the presentation here doesn't even really need to know that I just ripped out a middleware vendor and put in one of the competitors.
Exactly. And to the point of cost, you're now not having to reconstruct all those brittle systems that you had up before. So from a cost perspective, it just makes it a lot cheaper.
Well, and frankly, staging the testing and trying to do the coordination, and just the number of meetings you have to hold to find out when is the right moment to make that catastrophic change for every single constituent on the chain. Yeah. There's a lot of potential cost savings there.
Right.
And then, to kind of summarize what we've been talking, we did come up with a few questions that echo the topics, the dimensions that we've been going over on this webinar, which is really just a place for, again, I know that what we want people to take away from a conversation like this is, obviously you want to find some money. If there's wasted money, not good people, not good projects, we're not talking about that, but things that are just being spent that don't need to be spent. You can find some of that and bring it back. We know everyone's going to be on board with that. We don't want them to just think, okay, yeah, shelfware. I remember him saying shelfware several times.
Right.
And then we want them to think about, ask themselves some questions about, well, are we trying to accomplish some of these varied things? And it's a list that I think any sizable organization is going to be dealing with today, and any modern application, web or mobile or internet or things is going to be dealing with. The kind of questions we want people to ask themselves to say, all right, I can say yes to a lot of these things. I really think I need an API layer in here.
Exactly. I mean, look at this list as a diagnostic list, essentially. I mean, if you're answering yes to one or more of these questions, we really recommend that you take a look at an API architecture that will, not only enable you to get here to solve whatever issue you're trying to solve more quickly, but also do so in a really cost-effective manner. Because again, this isn't about ripping out and replacing old systems. It's about the systems you already have, that you're already running, how to leverage those, how to reuse those to save costs and provide more service.
Right on. And then, the folks that are listening, John, what would you tell them? Like, if you live the next 2 years out really quickly, we'll do some Einsteinian relativity here. You live the next 2 years real quickly. Now you come back today to tell us, what are most of these folks going to wish that they had done?
What are they going to wish that they had done? Well, absolutely, they're going to wish that they had decoupled their systems now. Okay. and really, they're going to wish they had done that, because the pressure that they're going to feel in terms of what's going to be asked of them and how much they're going to have to perform is going to increase exponentially. It already has. It started years ago, and it's just accelerating. So they're going to have to provide more services to the public, or to their agency partners, or to war fighters, using the systems they already have, because they're not going to get more money. We know that the budget environment and the governmental environment is not going to pour a bunch of money on them to create or to purchase new software, new services, nor do they really need to. So they're going to wish that they had started to leverage the systems they already had today to provide the kinds of services that they need to provide 2 years from now.
Got it.
So let's turn that around on you. So what do you think that they're going to be thinking about in 2 years? What do they wish they had done?
I think most companies, most agencies, most organizations are going to feel like they were too slow on the trigger. Yeah. Much like what happened when the webification of the world happened. Right. I think that we have employees using technologies they're not happy and productive with. Right. I think we're still treating mobile as a nice to have, and versus the way that the context shift, the way people are living their lives today. I mean, giving employees a mobile app that they can work with on the train or work with at home is not a nice to have. It's vastly increasing productivity. Right. Treating social like it's just a joke, just kids tweeting about what they had for breakfast. I think a lot of organizations are going to really regret that they didn't come around faster on some of these topics and start moving now while there's still a chance to look good.
Right, and I think there's one other point, which is working with companies around the world that are going through this, and obviously that's an enterprise environment, and we're talking with our folks on the government side. But the one thing that's common through all of this is the sooner you get started, the better off you'll be. because we know that inherently these things are going to take time. And so the change is already occurring, so you've got to get started now. And even the smallest project, even the most basic step in this direction, when you implement it, you'll start seeing changes in how your organization operates. Because of that decoupling leads to a changing cadence, and it leads to a changing cadence all throughout whatever organization it's in. So just by getting started, you'll see the path start to open up in front of you.
Great. And one last question. Like I said, you go around the world working with companies. What's the biggest misconception you see out there?
The biggest misconception is that this isn't just an IT project. You know, let's just, you know, this is like any other IT project. Let's just, you know, get it implemented, get it done, stand it up, and then kind of let it run in the corner, right? And that's not what this is all about, right? So this is about, we're talking about fundamental shifts in how people access and use data for services and products. And so even in a governmental construct, you're still dealing with users who don't sit in front of computers anymore, as you were pointing out, right? And so those users want services, and it's fundamentally not about the technology. It's fundamentally about the service you're providing to your users. And that's why we talked about the digital value chain at the outset of this. So for all of you that are listening, you know, you're going to continue to deal with the budget issues you're dealing with, and you're going to continue to have demands to provide these services, and it's really about providing those services. It's not so much about the software.
Right. And then if I could just weigh in as a counterbalance on the technical side, I think the misconception I see from a lot of folks is, well, I've already got some web services, or I've already got an ESB, I've already done some integration work, maybe even with a tiny little bit of exposure, therefore I'm done. And I would just think, well, it's 2014. I mean, of course you've built some of this, right? Of course you have some of this. You just wouldn't be able to function if you didn't. But there's a big difference between dabbling in it and becoming a full-on competitor with it, but between treating it across the organization as a real solution versus a project-based or spot-based solution. And again, this is not inherently an integration problem. Those have been relatively solved over the last 10, 15 years. And that's great that they're back there because it makes this step a lot easier. It's not even inherently an exposure problem. Because again, web services, maybe the kids you're hiring today, the newer groups, they're not as used to XML and they're not as used to web services, but it's still possibly usable. But it's really about consumption. Nobody gets any benefit from exposing functionality. It's only when that functionality is consumed.
It's not Field of Dreams, right? We're not just going to build it and like everyone's getting, you know, shoeless Joe shows up, right? Like it's about directing that exposure for the purpose of consumption and knowing who's going to be consuming it and building the exposure layer to that.
Exactly, because only through consumption are you actually delighting your employees and partners and users and customers. And developers are happy and transactions are flowing through, possibly some of them even being monetized, but but at the very least you're getting data flowing through, you're getting trending information. I mean, that's when all the good stuff happens, is in the consumption step. And unfortunately, that's the part that most people are neglecting when they're thinking that they've got it tackled.
That's right, exactly.
Great, so just to sum up, we have really hit the hammer hard on exposure and consumption layer versus an integration layer as being a necessary piece that just instantly brings a lot of goodness to the architecture. It makes it easy to find money lying around. And we looked at the fact that, you know, using this API facade to decouple your systems makes changes not catastrophic up and down. And APIs do make you better looking and give you the ability to fly.
Just look what it did for us.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the participation in this webinar. As always, we love the opportunity to talk about this stuff. We're really passionate about it. We had a blast. John, it was great talking to you again.
It was great talking with you, Brian.
All right, thanks, folks. Hope you have a really great day.